For months, one G7 leader has been notably reluctant to commit to either more sanctions on Russia or more military support for Ukraine. This week that changed. President Trump signed onto a joint G7 declaration pledging exactly both of those things: tougher sanctions on Russia's oil and gas sector, and expanded air defense and long-range weapons for Ukraine. In this video, we'll break down exactly what this declaration says, why Trump signing it is more significant than it might look, and what it actually means for the war going forward. Let's start with what was published. In the early hours of June 17th, 2026, just after midnight, G7 leaders released a joint statement from their summit in Evian-les-Bains, France. The opening lines set the tone. We, the leaders of the G7, stand united in our unwavering support for Ukraine and defending its freedom, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. From there, the statement gets specific in two directions. On the military side, the G7 committed to increasing the delivery of air defense capabilities, additional systems and interceptors, and long-range capabilities to Ukraine. Beyond just sending hardware, the leaders also pledged to help Ukraine scale up its own domestic military production, meaning support isn't just about shipments from abroad, it's also about building Ukraine's internal capacity to manufacture weapons itself. On the economic side, the G7 said they would, in their words, commit to increase the pressure on the Russian war economy and strengthen our sanctions, including those on the oil and gas sectors. That's a direct name target, Russia's energy sector specifically, which has historically been one of the largest sources of revenue funding its war effort. This was attended by leaders including Japan's Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz, Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, European Council President Antonio Costa, French President Emmanuel Macron, and President Trump. Here's the detail that multiple outlets specifically flagged as notable, and it's worth understanding why. Politico's energy and environment outlet, E&E News, described it plainly. Trump signed the joint declaration after leaders in France unexpectedly converged on backing Kyiv. Reuters separately characterized the unity of this statement as notable specifically because of, quote, the U.S.'s past reluctance to commit to either sanctions or continued military support. NBC News live coverage from the summit used almost identical language, calling it notable that Trump signed on, given his past reluctance to commit to either of those courses. So three separate news organizations independently flagged the same thing. This wasn't a routine diplomatic statement, it represented a shift from where the U.S. position had been for months. To understand why that's significant, it helps to remember the broader pattern. Trump's approach to the Russia-Ukraine war has generally emphasized pushing both sides toward negotiations rather than escalating pressure on Russia specifically, and his administration has been cautious about new sanctions packages that might complicate any future deal-making with Moscow. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney put a specific frame on this shift, speaking to reporters on the final day of the summit. He said there's been, in his words, a change in orientation from the United States on the war in Ukraine. He went further, suggesting Trump's position on Ukraine is now likely to be more realistic with regard to the situation in the field, in the war, and on the eventual result of the war. And he used a specific phrase here worth repeating exactly: the loss of Russia. That's a Western head of government on the record describing the emerging U.S. position as one that now anticipates a Russian defeat, not just a negotiated stalemate. Carney separately described the U.S.-Iran deal, the other major story out of the same summit, as a potential game changer, suggesting the administration's experience pulling off that Iran agreement may be feeding into how it's now approaching Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky was present for these discussions, and his own statements give us a sense of what Ukraine sees as the practical takeaway. Zelensky posted on social media that an agreement was reached with world leaders on what he called additional strengthening of Ukraine's air defense. He added, there will be new steps to put pressure on Russia over its war, pressure for the sake of peace, and said Ukraine's partners would, quote, ensure support for our defense and energy resilience. Separately, Zelensky said the G7 summit delivered important results for Ukraine. It's worth noting the specific emphasis on energy resilience here, because Ukraine's own energy infrastructure has been a frequent target of Russian strikes throughout this war, particularly heading into winter months. A pledge around energy resilience suggests this isn't just about offensive capability for Ukraine, but also about protecting its civilian infrastructure from continued Russian attacks. One additional detail from the G7 statement reported by Al Jazeera frames the diplomatic narrative the leaders are pushing. The G7 leaders explicitly agree that Russia is not winning the war. That's a notable line to include in a joint declaration. It's not just a pledge of support, it's a specific characterization of how the war is going, presumably meant to shape how any future negotiations get framed, by establishing up front that Moscow isn't negotiating from a position of battlefield success. It's worth being precise about what this declaration is and what it isn't, because joint statements at summits like this can sound more binding than they actually are. This is a statement of intent and pressure, not a detailed sanctions package with specific bank names, specific oil companies, or specific implementation dates. The language commits G7 nations to increase pressure and strengthen existing sanctions, which is meaningfully different from announcing, say, a specific new round of sanctions with a start date, the way some previous sanctions packages have been rolled out with concrete details attached. The actual mechanics of how this pressure gets implemented and by when will likely come out in follow-up announcements from individual G7 members rather than this joint statement itself. There's also a broader context worth remembering from the same summit. G7 leaders were simultaneously dealing with significant disagreements on other fronts, particularly around China's trade practices and a proposed critical minerals trading bloc, where countries were notably divided over how that should operate, especially given the U.S.'s America First trade posture. That tells you this G7 was a uniformly harmonious gathering. The Ukraine and Russia statement was a point of unusual convergence inside a summit that had real friction on other major topics. And there's an irony worth pointing out, given everything else happening this same week. This G7 statement on tougher Russia sanctions was published in the same 48-hour window as intense coverage of the US-Iran deal, where critics have specifically been asking why the administration hasn't released the actual text of that agreement. So you have the US signing a public, detailed-sounding pledge on Russia sanctions, while simultaneously facing questions about transparency on a separate major foreign policy deal happening in parallel. That contrast is worth keeping in mind when judging how much follow-through to expect here. While G7 leaders were finalizing this declaration in France, Russian President Vladimir Putin was occupied elsewhere, specifically attending a Russia-ASEAN summit, where he held meetings with leaders including Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and the Sultan of Brunei. He also made a cultural visit to the Annunciation Cathedral of the Kazan Kremlin and the Kul Sharif Mosque in Tatarstan, accompanied by the regional president there. This juxtaposition is worth noting simply as a snapshot of where each side's diplomatic energy was pointed during this exact week. Western leaders coordinating new pressure specifically targeting Russia's war economy, while Russia's own diplomatic activity that same week was focused on deepening ties in Southeast Asia, a region where Russia has been working to diversify its international relationships as Western sanctions pressure has built over the past several years. European Council President Antonio Costa has reportedly also been making separate attempts to establish contact with Moscow, aimed at preparing for possible future negotiations, suggesting that even as the G7 statement talks tough on sanctions, there's a parallel diplomatic track quietly trying to keep a line open to Russia for whenever talks do become viable. A few specific things worth tracking from here. Watch for follow-up announcements from individual G7 countries, the US, EU, UK, and others, that translate this joint statement's language about strengthening sanctions on oil and gas into actual named measures. The gap between a pledge to increase pressure and an actual implemented sanctions package is where these kinds of statements often lose momentum. So the next few weeks of individual country actions will tell you whether this was real policy shift or mostly rhetoric. Watch whether Trump's change in orientation, as Carney described it, shows up consistently in how the administration talks about Ukraine and Russia going forward, or whether this was a one-off moment of summit unity that fades once everyone's back home. Given how much commentary specifically focused on this being unusual for Trump, any reversal or softening in the coming weeks would itself be a notable story. And given the parallel timing with the Iran deal, watch whether the administration's apparent new confidence from pulling together that Iran framework, which Carney explicitly called a potential game changer, actually translates into a similarly assertive approach on Ukraine, or whether Russia proves to be a different kind of negotiating challenge entirely. The short version, G7 leaders, including Trump, just signed onto language that's notably tougher on Russia than what's come out of Washington for months. More sanctions on oil and gas, more air defense, and long-range weapons for Ukraine, and an explicit declaration that Russia isn't winning. Whether that translates into real, implemented policy or stays mostly symbolic is the thing to watch in the weeks ahead. Subscribe if you want that tracked here as it develops. Thanks for watching.